Something nobody tells you about meditation. Sometimes the first thing it gives you is not peace. Some people sit down, close their eyes, follow the breath, and for a while, everything gets clearer. Thoughts slow down. The body feels alive. Reality feels strangely bright. Then the light goes out. Fear appears for no reason. Meaning starts to dissolve. The person who sat down to meditate suddenly feels less solid than the thoughts passing through their head. And a terrifying question appears. Am I losing my mind, or am I finally seeing it? Buddhism has an answer, not a comforting answer. A map. Hey, I'm Matt from Buddha's Wisdom. Some of you wrote to me after our video on why life is suffering. Not the comments saying great video, the other ones. The ones that said, I started meditating and something went wrong. Or, I hit a wall I can't describe. Or simply, I feel like I'm falling apart and I don't know if that's supposed to happen. Those messages deserve an honest answer. A few of you who've been watching a while might remember something I mentioned in that suffering video. Lying on my apartment floor after a breakup, probably more honest than I meant to be on camera. I moved past it quickly, but something was happening on that floor that I didn't have language for at the time. A shattering of the story I'd been living inside. And for a while, I genuinely didn't know whether something had broken or whether something was, against all available evidence, breaking open. Before we name that experience, I want to introduce you to someone. Late 1970s, London. A man wakes in the early hours of the morning gripped by an unbearable sense of dread. He has studied at some of the finest universities in England. To anyone looking in, his life seems unremarkable, and yet something inside him has completely collapsed. He thinks, I cannot live with myself any longer. Then, a strange pause, a thought that stops him cold. If I cannot live with myself, there must be two of me, the one who cannot bear it and the one watching. He asks, if I'm witnessing my thoughts, what am I? His name is Eckhart Tolle. Not because he was secretly practicing Theravada Vipassana, he wasn't, but because that question points toward a fault line Buddhist practice traditions have recognized again and again. The gap between experience and the story called me. Once that gap opens, very little stays the same. That gap has a name. Actually, it has several. And the phrase most people know comes from a prison cell in 16th century Spain. Toledo, Spain, 1577. A Catholic monk named John has just been kidnapped by his own religious order, the very people he gave his life to serve. They drag him to a monastery prison and throw him into a cell roughly 6 feet by 10. No window. A small slit near the ceiling lets in perhaps an hour of weak light per day when the sky cooperates. Bread and water 3 times a week. He stays there for 9 months. His crime? He tried to reform his own order. He believed they'd grown comfortable. They disagreed. In that cell, in total darkness with nothing and nowhere, John doesn't break. He goes somewhere else entirely. He begins composing poetry in his head, memorizing lines in the dark because there's nothing to write with. When he finally escapes, lowering himself on a makeshift rope of knotted blankets through a narrow opening in the middle of the night, he carries those poems with him. Those poems and the commentaries written in the years that followed become part of one of the most studied mystical bodies of writing in Western Christianity. He calls the experience the dark night of the soul, la noche oscura del alma. Historians are careful here, and we should be too. The poems were composed and refined across several years after his imprisonment, not entirely within that cell. But the prison gave John something no theology book could. A body that knew what darkness actually felt like. The cell didn't write the poem, but it gave the poem its bones. his framework. At a certain point in the spiritual life, God's presence apparently withdraws. Prayer feels hollow. Devotion goes mechanical. The things that once made the interior life feel alive go silent. John argues this is purification. God removes the consolations, so the soul learns to walk in pure faith rather than in feeling. 2 phases: the night of the senses, detachment from physical pleasures and comfort, and the deeper night of the spirit, the stripping of spiritual identity itself. Most people experience the first. The second is rarer, more severe, and you won't find it in the retreat schedule. Buddhism doesn't use that phrase, dark night of the soul. That belongs to St. John. But Buddhism's version of this experience begins by questioning the very word most people would protect: soul. John's dark night purifies the soul and carries it toward God. Buddhism asks, what soul? And that question is not nihilism. It's the beginning of one of the most detailed accounts of this darkness ever preserved in a spiritual tradition. Jordan Peterson frames it this way: the dark night is the moment when everything external has been stripped away and all you have left is your character. Whether you can trust yourself, whether you compromised when something shiny was dangled. Buddhism takes that observation and asks what exactly that character is made of. We'll come back to that. John had a poem. Peterson has a framework. Buddhism preserved a path through this, and a path tells you where you are and what comes next. The darkness doesn't come first. In the Theravada meditation tradition, specifically in the insight practice called Vipassana, practitioners move through a series of stages. And before the dark stages comes something that feels like the opposite of darkness: the knowledge of arising and passing away, Udayabbaya-ñāṇa. This is where the practice opens. Everything sharpens. Thoughts arise and dissolve with crystalline clarity. There's a quality of aliveness, sometimes described as electric, a sense that reality has become transparent in a way it never was before. Meditators here often feel they've finally broken through, that the years of sitting, the early mornings, the slow and occasionally maddening work of watching the mind, all of it paying off at last. I've spoken with practitioners who describe this stage as the most extraordinary experience of their lives. One person said it was like watching his own mind in slow motion. Every thought rising, cresting, dissolving, each one leaving a trace of light. Another said she could sense thoughts forming before they fully arrived, and the gap between something happening and her reaction to it felt like discovering a room she never knew existed in a house she'd lived in for years. Beautiful. And then, the same practice that opened the sky opens the floor. The luminosity fades. What comes next doesn't feel like progress. It feels, to most people who hit it without knowing the stages exist, like collapse. The crash is not proof that the light was fake. Sometimes it means the light showed too much. We live in a culture that sells meditation as stress relief. Load an app, follow a voice, feel calmer in 10 minutes. Buddhism never reduced it to that. It treated meditation as a path that can dismantle the very self looking for relief. The same practice can feel like medicine at one depth and surgery at another. And when the surgical stage begins, the self experiencing it doesn't typically experience that as good news. The Buddha described conditioned experience through 3 characteristics: anicca, impermanence; dukkha, unsatisfactoriness; anattā, not self. In practice, these don't stay abstract. When Vipassana deepens, they stop being ideas the mind holds and become something it perceives directly. And that shift, from holding a concept to being shown the thing itself, rarely arrives gently. The Dhammapada states this directly in verses 277 through 279. Sabba sankhara anicca, all conditioned things are impermanent. Sabba sankhara dukkha, all conditioned things are unsatisfactory. Sabba dhamma anattā, all phenomena are not self. When the mind sees this directly, not reads it, not agrees with it, but sees it as the actual texture of every moment, something that had been gripping starts to loosen. What follows the luminous stage may feel like a crash. The stages say otherwise. What comes next is where the practice has always been heading. Mahasi Sayadaw was a Burmese Buddhist monk who died in 1982. He spent decades systematizing what the Theravada tradition had preserved for centuries, a detailed account of the insight stages that a practitioner moves through on the path toward awakening. Working from inside a living meditation lineage, documenting what practitioners repeatedly encountered, he produced a clinical-looking account of a strangely parallel spiritual crisis, a related kind of darkness to the one St. John navigated alone in that cell. His text, The Progress of Insight, Visuddhiñāṇa Katha, without the theology, without the waiting for God, with the care of a teacher who had walked this terrain alongside others and written down what they found. A ñāṇa is an insight knowledge, not a belief, not a concept, a direct seeing that changes how the mind relates to experience. Don't worry about the Pali, listen to the emotional weather. After the luminous knowledge of arising and passing away, the stages turn. Dissolution, bhanga-ñāṇa. What seemed solid begins to come apart. The sense of a stable, continuous self starts to feel unreliable. Thoughts, sensations, perceptions, arising and vanishing so rapidly that the continuity the mind once took for granted reveals itself as something assembled rather than found. Fear, bhaya-ñāṇa, arising without object. Pure existential dread with no identifiable cause. The practitioner searches for something to be afraid of and finds nothing, which makes it worse. Misery, adanava-ñāṇa, deep despair. Nothing feels worthwhile. The pointlessness feels bottomless. For some practitioners, this stage passes in hours. For others, it stretches into weeks. Disgust, nibbida-ñāṇa, a profound repulsion toward conditioned existence itself. The usual consolations, relationships, achievements, small pleasures, lose their grip. Not through indifference, but through a direct seeing that the grip was always costing something. Desire for deliverance, monchitu-kamyata-ñāṇa, the desperate wish to stop, to escape, to get out, of the practice, of the sitting, of existence itself. And here's the stage that almost every account of the dark night leaves out. Because at this point, most practitioners feel like they can see the exit, like it's almost over. It isn't. Reobservation, patisankha-ñāṇa. The mind turns back. It moves through the fear, the misery, the disgust again. Not because the practitioner failed, not because Buddhism is cruel, but because the insight hasn't fully landed. Whatever the mind was being asked to see, it hasn't seen it completely yet. And so the process repeats, sometimes multiple times, until it does. I remember reading this stage for the first time and thinking, this is the worst retreat itinerary in history. But Mahasi didn't invent the terrain from nowhere. He systematized a pattern already preserved in Theravada practice. The stages were already there. He gave them names. And finally, equanimity, saṅkharupeka-ñāṇa. The storm passes. A genuine stillness arises. The mind stops fighting what it sees. What remains is a stillness the tradition describes as genuine and unforced. Now, a question worth sitting with. Why does insight produce this particular sequence? Why fear, misery, disgust? Why does going deeper into practice produce this rather than simply more peace? Because the mind is finally seeing through its own constructions. The dissolution, the fear, the misery, these aren't signs something went wrong. They're what happens when insight penetrates deeply enough that the assembled sense of self can no longer maintain its usual grip. The darkness is not always a detour from the path. In this framework, it can be part of the path itself. Not something to manufacture, not something to romanticize. A natural consequence of insight working correctly within a supported, structured practice. Not all Buddhist teachers frame it this way. Some argue the Buddha's path is fundamentally one of joy, and that darkness only enters through misapplication or wrong conditions. That tension is real and worth acknowledging. But within the Theravada Vipassana tradition that produced this sequence, these stages are described as natural markers, not manufactured crises, not evidence of failure, and not optional stopovers on the way to somewhere else. This is one tradition's account, not the only one. Zen sometimes speaks of the great death, daishi, the collapse of the old self-view before awakening. Different language, different framework, similar warning. Tibetan Buddhism maps this dissolution through entirely different structures. The basic observation runs across all of them. When the sense of self begins to loosen, peace is rarely the first thing the mind reaches for. Buddhism has a specific word for the moment when the usual promises of life stop working. Samvega. Samvega is the shock and urgency that arises when a mind truly sees the futility of the cycle, the seeking, finding, losing, seeking again. The moment the game reveals itself as a game, not arriving as a philosophical idea, landing in the chest with the weight of something that cannot be unfelt. This differs from depression, from burnout, from a bad stretch of months. Samvega is the shock of clarity, and it has a counterpart. Pasada, serene confidence, the trust that a path exists through what Samvega has cracked open. Samvega breaks the old story. Pasada says, the breaking is not the end. Together, they form something the dark night traditions and other religions gesture toward but never quite name with this precision. What is dissolving is not you. It's the story you spent years telling yourself about who you were, what you needed, what you deserved to protect. So far, the Western tradition gave the darkness a name. Buddhism gave it a progression, and that progression begins with a luminous stage most people mistake for the destination. Now the path shows something most wellness culture won't tell you. In 2017, researcher Willoughby Britton at Brown University, alongside colleagues Lindell, Fisher, Cooper, and Rosen, published a study in PLOS One that made the meditation world deeply uncomfortable. They'd spent years collecting accounts from Western Buddhist practitioners who experienced not breakthroughs, but crises, severe anxiety, depersonalization, psychosis, suicidal ideation. Some had attended 10-day silent retreats, some had practiced for years, some were told by teachers, keep going. Britton's research didn't prove that meditation is dangerous for everyone. It proved something more uncomfortable. Meditation produces a far wider range of experiences than the wellness industry likes to admit. Some are brief and ultimately positive. Others are severe, prolonged, and impairing. And the study found that the same quality of dissolution, the same destabilization of self-view, could become insight, confusion, harm, or healing depending on context, guidance, mental health, and how the experience gets interpreted. Support didn't guarantee a smooth passage, but the absence of support made difficult passages far harder to navigate. The honest Buddhist position, the Dukkha ñāṇas exist within a structure, the Noble Eightfold Path, a qualified teacher, a community, years of ethical groundwork, sila, before deep practice begins. Some modern settings aren't built for the level of psychological material that intensive practice can uncover. Unprocessed trauma, dormant vulnerabilities. These can surface in ways that require proper professional support, not encouragement to push harder. When the practice gets stripped of that structure and sold as a standalone product, the old instructions disappear. Without the old instructions, people can mistake a dangerous passage for a dead end. These are not diagnostic rules, they are warning lights. If what you're experiencing has a quality of movement, arising within practice, carrying a sense of seeing something clearly even when it's painful. That may be the insight kind of darkness, uncomfortable, directional. If the darkness includes persistent inability to function, thoughts of self-harm, or a frightening loss of contact with reality, stop debating whether it's spiritual. That's a moment for immediate support. A therapist, a doctor, a teacher, someone you trust. Reach out. And if you're not sure which it is, that uncertainty itself is a signal. Reduce intensity before you increase effort. Talk to a qualified teacher. Talk to a mental health professional. The ego loves turning even pain into a test. Don't let it. The path is not asking you to prove how much you can endure. Wisdom does not need you to ignore your nervous system. Not every darkness is awakening. Sometimes darkness is suffering, and suffering deserves help. That's not failure. That's not a spiritual shortcoming. That's a human being in pain who deserves care. A real Buddhist teacher would agree. St. John says what survives is the soul, purified, united with God. Peterson says what survives is your character, the one real thing you carried before everything else was taken. Tolle says what survives is formless awareness, consciousness that was never born and cannot die. Buddhism answers from a stranger angle. Maybe the thing trying to survive the night was never as solid as it seemed. The goal is not to replace a broken identity with a spiritual identity. Buddhism is more ruthless than that. Remember Tolle from the introduction, the gap he discovered between the one suffering and the one watching. The question, if I'm witnessing my thoughts, what am I? Buddhism would recognize that question as a fault line opening up. The mind beginning to see that experience and the story called me are not the same thing. That gap, once seen, does not close on its own. And it points toward territory the tradition has spent centuries trying to describe precisely. The Anattā Sutta, among the earliest recorded teachings of the Buddha, found in the Pali texts at Samyutta Nikaya 22.59, addresses this directly. The Buddha moves through each of the 5 aggregates that make up what we call a person: form, rupa; feeling tone, vedana; perception, sanya; mental formations, sankhara; consciousness, vijnana. Our 5 aggregates video covers each of these in depth. Link in the description. What matters here is what the Buddha does with them. For every single one, he asks the same thing. Is this impermanent? Yes? Is anything impermanent ultimately satisfying? No. So can anything impermanent, unsatisfactory, and subject to change honestly be regarded as, this is mine, this I am, this is myself? The answer, examined carefully, is no. Buddhism doesn't answer what am I by handing you a more spiritual identity. It asks, can anything changing, unstable, and contingent honestly be called me? And then it waits for the mind to look carefully enough to answer for itself. Take Peterson's answer. Character. Does it hold steady under real pressure? Is it who you were 10 years ago? If it shifts, if it depends on conditions, if it forms and reforms across a lifetime, by what right does it call itself the essential you? Take Tolle's answer. Formless awareness. Is it fixed, separate, a permanent witness sitting behind everything, or also arising moment by moment, dependent on conditions? The Dukkha ñāṇas don't destroy the self. They reveal that what was being so carefully protected was always more assembled than it appeared. Stream entry, Sotapadhi, is the Theravada name for the first irreversible shift in perception that can follow this recognition, for practitioners who have gone all the way into the full structure of the path, with a teacher, with ethical groundwork, with a community holding the practice. Equanimity in the progression isn't the destination, it's the threshold. 3 fetters are cut through: self-view, the illusion of a fixed, permanent self; doubt, uncertainty about whether the path leads anywhere real; clinging to mere ritual as an end in itself; not full awakening, a permanent change in how the mind relates to experience. The tradition is clear: you cannot unsee what you've seen. Tolle writes about the years after that night in London. For a long time, he couldn't explain what had happened. What he knew was a peace he couldn't account for. Even the smallest, most ordinary things: a room, a table, light coming through a window. All of it perceived through stillness, rather than through the noise of a self managing its own survival. Buddhism would not say he found himself on the other side of that night. It would say he stopped losing himself in the story, which, it turns out, is the same thing. Buddhism gives us something practical, a sequence, a warning, and a way not to get lost. The roots are in the early teachings. The detailed sequence was preserved, refined, and passed on through generations of Theravada practice. It has been available inside serious practice traditions for those who knew where to look. We began this video in a culture that sells meditation as stress relief. Buddhism never made that promise. It offered something harder and more honest, a description of what the mind encounters when it goes deep enough to see through its own constructions. And crucially, a warning about what happens when that practice gets taken out of its container and handed to people without guidance. The Dhammapada, verses 153 and 154, contains some of the most famous lines attributed to the Buddha, understood by the tradition as his words at the moment of full awakening. He addresses the builder directly. "O house builder, you are seen. You will not build this house again. Your rafters are broken. Your ridgepole is destroyed. My mind has attained the unconditioned. The end of craving has been reached." The ridgepole is the central beam, the thing that holds the entire structure upright. Without it, the house cannot stand. The builder is craving. The house it keeps constructing is the story of self. Buddhism's answer to the dark night is not a dismantled self replaced by a liberated self. It's the recognition of what was doing the building all along. He didn't find a better house. He saw the builder. The dark night is not a destination. The Dukkha ñāṇas are not a badge of spiritual achievement. Samvega is not something to pursue. The sequence exists so that if the darkness comes, and for some serious practitioners, it can come, the person moving through it knows it has a shape, a direction, and beyond reobservation, beyond the cycling back through fear and misery, and the desperate wish to escape, there is a stillness the mind arrives at when it finally stops fighting what it sees. To everyone who wrote in, the ones whose practice got hard, who felt like they were going backwards, who wondered if something had broken inside them, what you felt may have had a name. What you moved through may have been recognized, named, and charted by generations of practitioners before you. People who sat with the same dissolution and fear and desperate wish to escape, and kept sitting. You are not the first, and you won't walk it alone. The dark night does not end when you find a brighter version of yourself. It ends when you finally see the builder of the self you spent your whole life trying to protect. If this opened something for you, our videos on why life is suffering, the 5 aggregates, no self, and the Jung and Buddha debate all go deeper into what we pointed toward today. All 4 are linked in the description. If you're sitting with something difficult right now, share only what feels safe. And if it feels serious, don't leave it in a comment section. Reach out to someone real. I'm Matt. This is Buddha's Wisdom. See you in the next one.